Everybody, welcome back. And we are going to get into Mark chapter 1 today. And we're going to work through the first couple of verses here as an intro to really set the trajectory of the entire tone and the entire thrust of this entire book. So we obviously went through some of the, kind of a broad stroke airplane view of some of the context here, some of the concepts. And so now we're going to get into this thing right from the jump. So what does Mark 1 actually say? So let's read it. Let's pull it up. It's going to say, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, as it is written in the prophets, behold, I send my messenger before your face, who will prepare your way for you? The voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord and make his path straight. This is a significantly loaded passage, and it is what Mark is communicating about this figure, this messianic figure who he believes is the one, the agent that God, the God of Israel, is going to send or has sent to essentially make all things new, right? So in some Christian traditions, you'll hear that there's different ways that each gospel portrays Christ, and I think that is true, right? But I think one of the mistaken ways to look at this is that Mark portrays Jesus as a servant, and servants don't have genealogies, therefore it says immediately, and because Mark uses the word immediately a lot. And when you tell a servant to do something, you expect him to do it immediately. But I think that misses the entire point. So the entire thrust of this kind of teaching series here is to reframe and situate Mark's gospel in the world that produced it, which we call Second Temple Judaism. And at this time, the late Second Temple historical period was incredibly messianic in its fervor, in its anticipation, and it was really apocalyptic, and we're going to use the word eschatological, which just means it's focused on the end of this present evil age. And so these ideas govern all of the interpretation of the entire text, and this is what we're going to use as a filter to interpret it. And as a side note, yes, everybody does have a filter. You could come from the Reformed tradition, you could come from a Calvinistic tradition, you could come from a Catholic tradition, you could come from an evangelical tradition. All of those things in some form or fashion give us glasses in how we read the Bible. We also have worldview. Growing up as a modern American, a Western American, we are generally averse to suffering, and we don't like it, but the gospel embodies it. The message of the gospel strongly suggests that suffering will be part of following Jesus, right? So these are kind of things that we tend to not read into the text, or maybe read out of the text. That being said, I think there's substantial and compelling evidence to say that in reasonableness, that the socio-historical and cultural context of the Second Temple period and what they thought should govern how we read it. That being said, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. So interestingly, I think there's only two other books in the Bible, right, that say something about the beginning right off the jump. One is Genesis, and the other is the Gospel of John. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And now this one says the beginning of the good news of Yeshua, the Messiah, the Son of God. Now, it's interesting that the word that Mark uses here is arche, in the beginning, which is not a neutral choice, but it deliberately echoes the opening words of Genesis. Okay? So a Jewish reader would have recognized that and felt it immediately, right away. So Mark is signaling from his very first word that what you are about to read in the story is not a mere biography, but it's actually the beginning of a new creation with this coming figure. The beginning of the end of the present evil age is here, and this is the dawn and the inbreaking of something that God has promised from the beginning, which culminates in a new or a renewed creation. This is super awesome. And the way that he comes in with his punch right here from the beginning communicates the urgency of the time and the urgency of the response that Jesus is looking for. So the beginning of the gospel, the word immediately communicates urgency, I think, and that really fits well with the overall story and the historical context of being a Second Temple Jew. Now, the word euangelion, which is Greek, which is where we translate the word gospel from, it's good news, okay? It's kind of has a multifaceted function here. It's multi-layered. So in the Jewish scriptural tradition, this word euangelion in the Hebrew is bezorah, came loaded with all kinds of fingerprints, but especially the book of Isaiah. So in Isaiah 52, the 7th chapter, it says, how beautiful are the feet of him who brings good news, euangelion, who says to Zion, your God reigns. So the gospel, as communicated in the New Testament, is inseparable. It's one and the same with the coming kingdom of God, which is good news for those who are faithful to the God of Israel and what God is going to do, provided we love righteousness and justice. And it's going to be bad news for those who don't, and the unrepentant wicked, which we see thematic throughout the entire biblical revelation. But this text in Isaiah 52 was one of the most electrically alive, vibrant, robust, fervent texts in the Second Temple period, especially the late Second Temple period. And so, for example, the Qumran community, which we've talked about a lot, there's a lot of affinity with the Jesus movement here. Applied it to a figure proclaiming the final liberation in the last Jubilee year. So if you guys don't know what the Jubilee year is in Israel's calendar, we'll find this in, I believe it's Leviticus 25. Every 50th year, there was a release of debts. And also any land that had been acquired would be restored and returned back to its original inheritor when Israel first settled the land, which is kind of cool, right? It's really cool. So there's a lot of release language, liberation language with the Jubilee. And so when we look at some of the language that depict this messianic figure that's coming as an eschatological deliverer, like he's described with Jubilee-like language. We see that in Isaiah 61, which Jesus quotes in Luke 4, to liberate the oppressed, to open the eyes of the blind, to proclaim good news to the poor, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, etc., etc. This is all Jubilee-based language. So to invoke the euangelion, the good news, was to actually invoke the imminent, public, visible, historical reign of the God of Israel that will break into the world cataclysmically and climactically when this present evil age ends. Now, in the Roman world, interestingly, the same word was stamped on imperial propaganda. For example, there's a Priene inscription from the ninth year before Christ, okay, which described the birth of Augustus Caesar as the beginning of the good news for the world. Now, Mark's Jewish audience would have heard both registers at the same time, because they're living in the Roman Empire, in the diaspora. And so this collision of ideas was purposeful. So the real gospel, the real good news, is obviously not Caesar's, but it's the God of Israel's and his anointed Messiah. This is super important because he's claiming that the real king who's going to crush Caesar's kingdom is this crucified man from Judea, which is really potent. And I think when we get into the weeds a little bit, in the book of Acts, we see a lot of pushback on Paul going to the Gentiles. And it's not because the Jews were racist, and it's not because the Jews didn't want the Gentiles to repent. Like, they knew the Bible. They knew what the Bible was talking about. I believe, through my own studies, it's that the Jews were given a pass to not worship the Roman imperial cult, the gods of Rome, and especially Caesar. And they would prove that they were Jewish by pulling their pants down, and they would be circumcised, evidentially circumcised, which would give them a pass because their religion, their worldview, their customs went back to even before the Roman Empire. So Roman Empire wanted to accommodate them. So through their dispersion, their little synagogue communities throughout the Roman Empire, they were treated fairly. They were given, they weren't mandated to worship the gods of Rome. So when Paul is going out there and proclaiming this gospel of this king of Israel to the nations, this has implications where the Jewish the local synagogue communities would be at risk. And so in the book of Galatians, in the end of Galatians, we have Paul identify his opponents as those who don't do the Torah, who don't keep the law, who are compelling the non-Jewish people to become Jewish via circumcision so that they would avoid persecution for the cross of Christ. And again, hear me out. If Paul is going out there and Paul's little cohort of gospel proclaimers are going out there to the nations and saying that there's another king, and this king is actually going to bring a kingdom like right imminently that's going to crush this whole Caesar thing, and this Roman imperial behemoth, this monolithic empire is going to be decimated and collapse at the coming of Christ, this king of Israel who's been crucified and raised from the dead. This is, for anybody that didn't receive that message, this is offensive, and they knew that Paul was a Jew, this was a Jewish message, and they're going to the synagogues and they're going to have a problem here. So they're trying to avoid being persecuted by their Roman imperial domineers and avoid having an upset to their way of life. And so they did not want Paul to go out there and to proclaim this king of Israel in his coming kingdom, because it was so dangerous, really, within the Roman world. So I want to end here and pick up on the next one as we get into this, so we're not going too long. So this is pretty cool, guys. I hope this is helpful, and it brings a lot of light and a lot of audacity to the gospel. It's so good, and this is why people suffer and die for the message. And we'll get into this as we go. Blessings, guys.